George R. Martin wrote an epic series of fantasy novels in which, if you replaced the second through fourth books by a single sentence, Westeros is a shithole, you wouldn't have missed anything. Fortunately, the Ignobles faction in Smash Up doesn't rely on the mechanic of killing narrators, because how would you do that in a card game? But instead it relies on the mechanic of loaning out your minions to other players for some sort of gain, which turns out to be a lot more interesting. I've got to start this with a disclaimer. I'm not sure of Ignoble's strength with a Titan. It's definitely significantly better than it is without a Titan. It's definitely not a top 15 faction in either 1v1 or in multiplayer. But I won't know where in that huge range it stands until I stop forgetting power counters when I give control of a minion to another player. That makes a big difference. Ignobles presents an interesting natural design problem because most other combo factions show on the face of the card the text for one piece of the combo that will become greater when you line up both pieces. Ignobles cards don't look like that. If you take a look at Repaying Debts, when it says do this too, and then the effect of the total combo, getting to draw 2 cards and play an extra minion from a single action. And so when you look at this card, you're seeing the result of the combo of playing a Repaying Debts and getting back the missing minion, which is greater than the sum of its parts, and visually this card is going to look better than it really is. So I think that may be one reason why the Ignobles started their lives out a little bit underpowered. They're the equivalent of a 3/3 for 2 mana in Magic, which has a drawback, but this isn't Magic. You can't make an easy analogy to how much of a drawback they need, and so originally the designers just came up with drawbacks that were reasonable but not quite enough upside on the faction to compensate them for the drawbacks. And fortunately, the Titan does a pretty good job of covering this. I'm going to get everything about other factions out of the way quite quickly here. In your matchup, if you want your Ignobles to have a good game, you want to make sure that you have at least one opponent without either sacrifice for gain or movement that only works on minions they control. And this is because you are loaning out your minions and then taking them back, and many of your best combos involve you giving a minion to another player for at least a full turn and getting it back a little later. And your opponents know that you have a lot of ways to get back minions you own, so your minions will be less valuable to them than other minions they own. If you loan out a minion to someone who can sacrifice or catfight it away for gain, they will pick your minion over theirs every time. If you loan out a minion to someone who has extra cards that can move their minions elsewhere, they may decide to move the loaned minion somewhere completely useless where it rots for the rest of the game. And both of these can make your Ignobles not quite function right. So in order to get a good match, you want to make sure that you have at least one safe opponent to donate your cards to, where you know you're usually going to get them back intact. And for a partner, my go-to partner for Ignobles will be Apes, because they are big, dumb sources of power, which tend to be what the Ignobles need the most, is more power. And also, Apes can make good use out of either extra minion plays or extra action plays, because the Ignobles tend to generate one or the other on various turns in different combinations via either Aunt of Drakes or Repaying Debts. I would also think that Bears, Shapeshifters, and anything else with high minion power totals will work pretty well with Ignobles. And for Shapeshifters specifically, keep in mind that your Copycat can do really funny things if you've loaned out an Aunt of Drakes or a Foot of the King, and you copied those abilities. you can use the Shapeshifter's minion to make your Ignobles smoother. Without a Titan, the Ignobles have a normal complement of 30 minion power, paired with extra minion plays attached to their 2 power minions, and their actions give them a pretty normal set of 2 extra minion plays and 4 card draws, all of which are attached to repaying debts. This is pretty normal until you realize they also don't have any power boosts on their actions. They actually don't have any power boosts at all, and they have a tendency to temporarily donate their minions to other players and can't always get all of them back before the base breaks. This means that Ignobles without a Titan can play their minions fairly quickly, but end up underpowered in terms of power drawn per turn. Gregor, their Titan, helps quite a bit with this. He does 2 huge things. First off, he lets you take back a minion every turn, or draw a card by donating a minion, which means that your cards with a drawback, the drawback isn't nearly as bad because the drawback becomes temporary because Gregor takes them back. The second thing he does is he gives you a power counter, or you may place a power counter, whenever you give control of one of your minions to another player. And right now I'm estimating that this is probably worth an extra 5 minion power in your deck. And since this doesn't directly cost a minion or action play, it really is just sort of just as good as, say, having 3 of your Sneaky Squires have 3 power instead of 2, and 2 of your Betrothed have 4 power instead of 3. It actually gives you a little bit of a hook to work with to try and have more power in play than other players. They're still not going to be great, but this means that you now at least have something to aim at when trying to gain an advantage with the Ignobles. Ignobles cards are complicated enough that the individual Ignobles are worth a look here. So let's start with Aunt of Drakes. With Gregor available, and most partner factions that don't have a lot of power actions, she's basically talent draw a card, because the extra action will rarely be all that useful with just Ignobles, except maybe to undo a drawback of another Ignobles card, and the card is useful and Gregor undoes the giving away a card. But if you don't have Gregor available, she's going to be somewhere between that and a blank card because you're going to lack ways to get your minions back. So often you just have to not play her talent. On the other hand, if you have a lot of power actions in your partner faction, she's going to be a lot better. You're going to get a straight power boost out of that extra action, and she turns into a really, really valuable card if you're playing them with Astroknights or Dinosaurs or Apes or anything else that gets lots of mileage out of extra actions. Foot of the King is fantastic, probably the most useful individual ability for the Ignobles out of all their minion abilities, except that end of turn activation is much weaker than having take control of a minion you own as a talent. If you're planning on breaking a base this turn and Foot of the King will be involved in the base break, you can't use his ability because he's already discarded before you reach your end of turn step. So he's a little bit awkward, but nevertheless you can use him to play a Sneaky Squire as an extra minion each turn and get it back before the start of your opponent's turn. Sneaky Squire without a Titan is more or less a worse Zapbot or maybe a worse Microbot, something like that. He's a worse robot. With the Hill that strolls, you can play him as an extra minion, as an extra 3 power minion, and he starts to generate some serious power jumps. And finally, Betrothed looks like a great card, but it's just not a good card overall. Sometimes in multiplayer you can get away with playing her and get better than usual value for a 3 power minion by getting an extra victory point out of her. But most of the time that extra victory point isn't going to be worth more than a 3 power minion, and so why are we giving away our Betrothed to gain this? Well, Usually the answer is you're giving her away without having to use some sort of action to do it, plopping a power counter on her and then taking her back in the same turn so that you've played your 3 as a 4. And that's actually kind of useful. Repaying Debts, like I've already talked about it has a drawback that Gregor can remove. It's a very awkward card if you don't have a Titan. Awkward but potentially powerful. With a Titan, it's a powerful card, and it's more or less just a combination of Mystic Studies and Summon in a single card. It's a very good card then. Red Birthday Party. Now this is an interesting card because I've heard some people talk about it being really good, and it's not. It looks like Powder Keg, except saying with less power instead of with equal or less power. The problem is, Ignobles doesn't have Buccaneer. So you don't have a way to play this card without losing one of your minions, and unfortunately it also says a minion you own instead of a minion you control. Okay, so for most cases a minion you own is better, but you don't want to be blowing that minion up. You want to be taking it back. It's a card that doesn't directly contribute to you having more power of your own, and I have a hard time finding positions where you can get good value out of Red Birthday Party, and it's not because one of your opponents did something flat out dumb. It's pretty easy to play around Red Birthday Party, and when you play around it, you usually don't give up too much to do so. So Red Birthday Party in hand isn't even giving you that much value in terms of restricting what your opponent can do. It's just, a 4 is often worth a lot more than a 3, a 5 is often worth a lot more than a 4, especially if there's other removal flying around the board. It's usually going to be a bad trade. But on the other hand, this card, Hostage Exchange, this is probably your best single action, and you want to get really, really good value out of it whenever you play it. Give another player control of one of your minions, which you're going to take right back with Gregor or with any of your actions. Maybe you're going to use Aunt of Drakes to get a double action so that you can play Activate the Spy to take back your big minion right away, and you do this to take control of one of their minions of equal or less power. This is your only good way to steal minions that you don't actually own, and it's really, really good because stealing a 4 or a 5 with a useful talent can be a game-changing play. So try and get something really devastating out of Hostage Exchange. I kind of wish this card was a 2 of an Ignobles because it's a fun card to play, and because you have to give up your own minion, it doesn't end up feeling that overpowered to play against, but it really enables a lot of plays. The other note out of it, Out of Sight and Fate of the Favorites work poorly with Hostage Exchange because once you've stolen one of your opponent's minions, playing a card that tells everyone to do something bad to a minion they own means you lose the stolen minion. But since all 3 cards are one-ofs, you can usually avoid lining the cards up.